On today's show, new Cavs head coach Kenny Atkinson often gets labeled as a developmental head coach. We'll talk about how he got that label and why it might not be entirely true on today's Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find this show anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Drop us a 5-star review if you can. That's how you can help us grow the show. Also, be sure to check us out on YouTube. If you're not watching this video, search Locked On Cavs on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that like button on this video. And of course, click that notification bell so you know exactly when the latest content from Locked On Cavs is going live. Of course, a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Hi again, everybody. I'm Danny Cunningham. You might know me from my time covering the Cavaliers at places like 92.3 The Fan, Cleveland Magazine, and a number of other stops along the way. Want to talk about Kenny Atkinson today because one of the things that often gets thrown around with Kenny Atkinson is that he is a developmental coach. And yes, that's true. I think Kenny Atkinson has done a great job of developing talent over the years. I think that is a little bit unfair to only label him as that, though. And I want to talk about why that's the case today. So let's first start with, well, he's got this label as a developmental coach. How did he get there, right? I think that's the right place to start with this conversation. And I think that begins by you go and you look at his history, where he, of course, spent a good chunk of time, as most head coaches in the NBA do. He spent a good chunk of time as an assistant coach. He got his start with the New York Knicks. Then he spent time in Atlanta under Mike Budenholzer, and then ultimately was hired in the 2016-17 season. He was hired to be head coach of the Brooklyn Nets. That Nets team, of course, as I think a lot of us remember, was not very good. And why do we remember that? Because the Cavs had one of the Brooklyn Nets picks the year after Kenny Atkinson was hired. That was his second year on the job. The Cavs had an unprotected Brooklyn Nets pick. So a lot of Cavs fans have watched and, I guess, rooted against Kenny Atkinson at certain points in his head coaching career. But what he did there in Brooklyn really is how he got the developmental label. Because you look at that situation he took over on the Nets, where they had made a disastrous trade a few years before. One of the worst trades in NBA history. Trading unprotected pick after unprotected pick for an old version of Kevin Garnett and an old washed up version of Paul Pierce. That got them, I believe, a playoff series win. Obviously, if they could do that trade over again, they never would do that. Those picks, by the way, turned into Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and ultimately Colin Sexton here in Cleveland. So, because that was the case, the Nets were in a place where they didn't have much talent, but it also didn't make sense for them to just go out and lose every night. They couldn't tank because they didn't have control of their draft. In addition to, sending unprotected picks to Boston, they also sent pick swaps to Boston too. So if they were bad and Boston was good, they still got a first round pick. It's how they drafted Jared Allen, but they didn't get their own pick. They ended up picking in the 20s instead of in the top 5. So because of that, the talent situation in Brooklyn was really, really bad. Kenny Atkinson at that time was tasked with trying to just make something out of absolutely nothing. It was probably the worst roster in the NBA around that time. Maybe you could make a case for Philadelphia, who was in the early years of the process at that point, where Joel Embiid really wasn't playing quite yet. And, it wasn't until the 2018 season that they made the playoffs. But that first year Kenny Atkinson was in Brooklyn, you could make a case that maybe Philly had a worse roster. I think that was Embiid's rookie year. Ben Simmons didn't play. So you could make that case. What he did was he took a team that realistically should have been a 12 to 15 win team, which obviously is very bad. But think of them as that's a team that was similar to what this year's Detroit Pistons were, except they didn't have a Cade Cunningham. but that's who they were similar to. They were that level of bad. And that team won 20 games, which you take a look at, if you pull up Kenny Atkinson's basketball reference and you take a look, oh, they won only 20 games. That's awful. Yeah, that's not great. That's not what you want. But it's also very far above what the expectations were for that Brooklyn Nets basketball team. That team was supposed to be, and ultimately was, one of the worst in the league, but it was supposed to be worse than it actually was. Then you fast forward the next year, and this is the year that the Cavs fans are very familiar with, where that Nets team, again, was predicted to be one of, if not the worst team in basketball. They didn't have much talent. They just didn't have much going well for them. Kenny Atkinson took a team that, again, should have won somewhere probably that year between 18 and 22 games as they started to grow just a little bit. That team won 28 games. And no, is that something to write home about, to be super proud of? No. But when you take a look at the situation, it's impressive, I think, what he got out of that group. And then you fast forward a year later, the Nets go 42-40. They make the playoffs. So that trend there, those first 3 years, really earned him the title as a developmental guy. And what I think scares some people about this is, what does that 3-year stretch sound like? It sounds like JB Bickerstaff's first 3 years in Cleveland, where he took over a team that was in not as bad of a space as the Nets were. There was definitely more talent here in Cleveland when Bickerstaff took over than when Atkinson took over in Brooklyn. But he took over a team that was in a bad place. And he got that team in that third year to not the playoffs because they lost in the play-in, but he got them to 44 wins, which was more than Atkinson got the Nets to in the year that they made the playoffs. I think they were either the 6th or the 7th seed. They were a good team. That, I understand, can be scary. And then Atkinson lasted another half season after that postseason berth. But what happened that offseason? Well, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and DeAndre Jordan signed in Brooklyn, and it just created a mess that I don't think any coach would have survived. So I don't blame Kenny Atkinson for that. So he does get that developmental label a little bit because of that 3-year stretch where he took them from bad to pretty solid. And ultimately, they won a single playoff game under Kenny Atkinson. So he does still, I think, have a lot to prove in terms of not being a developmental coach. But I think that the way he developed the Nets gives me hope that he's not just a developmental guy, and that label could be a little bit unfair. Because you think about what JB Bickerstaff did here in Cleveland and what I would anticipate him to do in Detroit as a quote-unquote developmental coach. He got the Cavs to play defense. Now, part of that was unquestionably the way the roster was constructed, where this team under Bickerstaff was built to be very defense first. Before they acquired Donovan Mitchell, the backbone of this roster was Jared Allen. It was Evan Mobley. Of course, you had Darius Garland to provide offense as an all-star. You had Lauri Markkanen, who was awesome his year in Cleveland. But that was a team that won games with defense. They scored enough points, but they won because they were able to keep opponents from scoring enough points. That's how you look at that. Kenny Atkinson, while his offenses in Brooklyn weren't exactly great, no one's going to confuse them with the 2016 Warriors, but they didn't win because they were suffocating defensively. They found ways to win despite not really being great on either end. One of the things that they did was, and this is rare when you see a team be good when you see a quote-unquote developmental team be good, it's often because of defense. It's often the route that JB Bickerstaff got the Cavs to take. And what you often don't see there is a team have a fast pace. You see that with bad teams, but not often teams that overachieve. Where the Nets under Atkinson, they were top 11. I think his last year they were 11th. The 3 years before, they were top 10 in pace in the NBA. The Cavs have not sniffed top 10 in pace in the NBA. Now, part of that is roster construction. That's not all Kenny Atkinson. I do expect him to want to play much faster this year in Cleveland than JB Bickerstaff's teams did. So that is one thing to think about. But the other thing that I do think about here is Kenny Atkinson often gets talked about as a really bright offensive mind, a really bright offensive basketball mind that he's going to be able to get the most out of guys like Evan Mobley and Darius Garland, not just because he's going to develop their skills, but because he's going to develop an offense that gets the most out of them. And I think that is a very important distinction to make, because there are developmental coaches that can develop players and make players better, but they can't develop teams. And I think what Kenny did in Brooklyn was he developed teams more so than players. Because if you look at this Cavs roster, and I know that there are a couple of common denominators here when you talk about Jared Allen and you talk about Karis LeVert, but this Cavs roster has much, much, much more talent than any of those rosters in Brooklyn did. Not even close. And he got more out of that talent than I think JB Bickerstaff got out of the talent here in Cleveland. So if he can replicate that in Cleveland, I think that developmental label will be shed pretty quickly. Now, of course, the thing we need to see is, well, how does this translate to the playoffs? Because ultimately, that's what matters the most. Is Kenny Atkinson's not going to be judged on how many games he wins and loses in the regular season. He's going to be judged on playoff success. That's really where the developmental label could be shed. I've got high hopes for him because of the offensive stuff, because of what he has shown he can do. And the thing that I think is worth mentioning, and I've mentioned this a bunch when talking about Kenny Atkinson, one of the things I think worth mentioning with him is he spent his years between being a head coach from the time he was let go in Brooklyn to the time he took the job at the Cavs with the LA Clippers under under Doc Rivers, and the Golden State Warriors under Steve Kerr. That matters. It matters I don't think Doc's a great coach, but it matters being around winning situations. So that is the other thing to think about. One other thing I want to touch on in today's Locked On Cavs. How can they get the most out of Darius Garland again after his nightmare of a 2023-2024 season? That's next right here on Locked On Cavs. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. I want to be at peak performance. I need my vehicle to be at peak performance. They've got superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're in a speed, power, style, all three of them, eBay Motors has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And this is important. Listen to this part. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. And are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? You have to turn the volume down with all that shouting. Well, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that's programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So one of the things that gets talked about pretty frequently with the Cavs right now is the play of Darius Garland. And I think part of this is because the three other members of the core four, you talk about Donovan Mitchell, you talk about Jared Allen, you talk about Evan Mobley, those three guys all got contract extensions this offseason. Now, a contract extension was never in the cards for Darius Garland this year. That just was not something that was going to happen. I don't think he was even eligible for an extension this year. So just keep that in mind. But he's unquestionably coming off of what everyone is considering maybe not the worst season of his career, but certainly the worst season after the rookie year of his career, where he just was a shell of what he was when he was an All-Star. You take a look back at what he was in the 21-22 season, and Darius Garland was phenomenal. He was fantastic. He deserved to be an All-Star. He was an All-Star, and it was great. And then you thought, okay, this should be a regular occurrence for him. He should be at the All-Star game, maybe not every year, but every other year. He should be a multi-time All-Star. It should not be a one-year fluke. I certainly believe that. I still do believe that's there in Darius Garland. And we know the story where he had a fractured jaw. There was a death in his family. There were some other nagging injuries that bothered him for a good chunk of the basketball season that just led Darius Garland's game to not be what we've become accustomed to with Darius Garland's game. He was, again, a shell of himself. Now, the question that is worth asking here is, how do the Cavs get Darius Garland back to being Darius Garland? That, I think, is a pretty big key to this season. If Darius Garland returns to form, the Cavs are going to be really, really good again. Now, I think they should be really good anyways, but if he returns to form, it takes them to another level that I don't think that there are other ways to achieve. Yeah, Donovan Mitchell can do a lot. He can take this team a long way. Evan Mobley, I expect a ton out of. But having a second dynamic ball handler, a second dynamic scoring threat in the backcourt, I think that matters. And there's not someone else that can really take on that role. Certainly not the way Darius Garland can. So how does he get back to that? What does that look like? Does it look like exactly what it looked like when he was an all-star? Probably not, just because I don't think that the volume will necessarily be there. You know, he attempted over 17 field goals a game the year he made an all-star team. I'm just not sure I see a number that high when he's sharing a backcourt with Donovan Mitchell. And that's fine. That doesn't mean he still can't be an all-star caliber player if he's taking 15 shots a game. Maybe it doesn't have to go down very much at all, because if you take a look at the numbers his all-star year and then the numbers the first year with Donovan Mitchell that Darius Garland put up, they're not all that different. Yeah, the scoring was slightly down. He scored 21.7 points the year he made an all-star game, 21.6 points the year Donovan Mitchell first arrived. So, okay, that went down a little bit. The shot attempts went down by 1, but he was more efficient. You take a look at his three-point shooting percentage went from 38 to 41. His two-point shooting percentage, that dipped a little bit. But overall, he was a more efficient player. He got to the free throw line more. He did things at a much better rate, and then that disappeared this year. Now, let me ask you this. Did this disappear because that fit between these two guys doesn't work? Or did that disappear because of everything Darius Garland went to? Maybe you believe the former. I think it's the latter. I think that these two can coexist. I think that there's ways, and I think we saw this the first year Donovan was here. I think we saw this as a thing that, okay, this works. How do we get back to that? How do the Cavs get back to what it looked like the first 2 years they were together, or the first year they were together? The thing that I point to is the catch and shoot three-point opportunities, and really the three-point attempts as a whole. So that first year Donovan Mitchell was in Cleveland, Darius Garland took 6 3-point attempts per game, shot 41%. He was awesome. He was terrific from beyond the arc. And that is a big reason why the Cavs offense worked as well as it did in year one. That's a big reason why they won 51 games, was because those two worked together. And also, you know, I don't remember off the top of my head, I need to look it up, how many games that Donovan Mitchell played. But Darius Garland, that year, he played 69 games. That's a lot of basketball. That if you get 69, 70 games out of Darius Garland this year, you're going to be very, very happy with that. If he plays 69 games, Donovan Mitchell played 68 games that year. If you get that from both of those guys, you're going to be thrilled. Thrilled. But you got to get the three-point shooting too. And that number went up a little bit. It went from 6.0 to 6.2 this year. But I need to see that number go from 6.2 to 8 or 8.5. If he's taking 8.5 three-pointers per game for the Cavs this year, I think that offense is going to look much better. I think that there's going to be more space, not only for him, not only for Donovan Mitchell, but for Evan Mobley too. I think that does matter. And then the other thing, the thing that did drop significantly this year, and I think that this is a big key for him, is the number of two-pointers he attempted went down. And I think a lot of this is at the rim. And I understand why this happened. Because if I had fractured my jaw, would I want to go to the rim that frequently? Probably not. I wouldn't. So I get it. But he went from taking just under 10.5 two-pointers a game in Donovan Mitchell's first year in Cleveland to 8.5 two-pointers a game this past year. And I think there's a big correlation there between the jaw injury and some of the other bumps and bruises, nagging injuries that he had throughout the year, and that number sliding. I think that number needs to get back up. But I do think that there could be a couple more shots that he can find. He only took 14.8 a game. If you get that number up to 17, that's a couple extra 3-pointers. It's another drive to the basket. I think that's the way to make this work. If that does work, I think it opens up a lot offensively for this team. I think that this team can really get more out of this group than they have. And getting back to what I talked about with Kenny Atkinson, he's the guy that I trust to be able to do that. I think that he is going to be able to devise ways to get the most out of this group together offensively. I really do think that to be the case. And I'm excited to see what Darius Garland looks like under Atkinson, because ultimately, this is another way to look at this. Who would you rather have? Who do you believe is the better basketball player between Darius Garland and D'Angelo Russell? Personally, I think it's Garland. But Kenny Atkinson got D'Angelo Russell to play at an all-star level. If he can do that, I'm very excited. Very excited about what he can get out of Darius Garland. I think that's a very important part of this season. The Cavs roster, though, while they've signed extensions, they've not made any outside changes. They've not even re-signed all their own. It's not a finished product yet. How do I know that? Because it can't be a finished product yet. We'll talk about that straight ahead here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. They are an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. And of course, that makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. Maybe you want to go check out the Cleveland Guardians tonight. The best team in baseball, the Cleveland Guardians, best record in the MLB. Maybe you want to go watch them at Progressive Field tonight. I know they split their series this weekend with the Baltimore Orioles, but hey, a hot streak could be right around the corner. They've been playing pretty good baseball lately. Like I said, they've got the best record in baseball, so maybe you want to go check them out. Well, Gametime, they're the place to go because they've got killer last-minute deals, all in prices. So when you click on a ticket on the Gametime app, it's going to tell you what you're going to pay. You're not going to be bombarded with taxes and fees at the last minute. They'll show you the view from your seat, and of course, they've got the lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. So you do that by downloading the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA, that's LOCKEDONNBA, for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So the Cavs right now don't have enough guys on their roster to, build an actual roster. Yeah, their rotation, I think, is pretty set. Now, Isaac Okoro is outstanding, and that is one of the things that is going to continue to be talked about. I don't know how long that's going to drag out. My best guess is that Okoro is back in Cleveland. I don't know what that deal is going to look like, but I think that's going to be the case. We'll get news on that at some point, but think about how long, even a few years ago, when they traded for Donovan Mitchell, who was part of that trade? Colin Sexton was. Colin Sexton was in the same position that Isaac Okoro is in right now, where he was a restricted free agent. Cap space had dried up across the league. I think Colin probably had more suitors as a sign-and trade option than Isaac does, but there just aren't many real options right now for Isaac Okoro. So I think that that's sort of the perfect storm for this to drag out and really last until who knows when. And the Cavs have had this for a number of times throughout their history. You can go all the way back to when Anderson Varejao was a restricted free agent. And then Tristan Thompson had the same thing when he was, I believe, a restricted free agent. You look at J.R. Smith, who had a holdout late into training camp. This happened, like I said, with Colin Sexton a couple years ago. These types of things happen. And for whatever reason, it feels like they happen in Cleveland more often than they happen anywhere else. But right now, as of today, the Cavs have 12 guys under contract for this upcoming season. They've got Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen, Karis LeVert, Max Strus, George Niang, Dean Wade, Jalen Tyson, Ty Jerome, Sam Merrill, and Craig Porter Jr. They've got a few roster spots to fill. Of course, they can carry up to 15 guys full-time on full-time NBA contracts, plus 3 guys on two-way deals. For the two-way deals, my suspicion is that they would like to have Amani Bates back on a two-way deal. I think Pete Nance makes sense to come back on a two-way deal again. I don't know about that third slot. Maybe it's Luke Travers. I wasn't overly impressed with him in Summer League. I thought he showed flashes, but I expected more out of him. I thought he would look a little bit more ready to grab an NBA spot. So I don't know what's going to happen there. The other aspect of things, they need another big man. They do. They've got Jared Allen. They've got Evan Mobley. Those guys are constants, we know, but you need some depth at that spot. Think to last year where they had Damian Jones. They had Tristan Thompson. I think Tristan Thompson coming back makes a lot of sense. I don't know if he still wants to keep playing. I'm not entirely sure. I don't have clarity on that situation, but I do think it could make some sense to bring him back as a veteran locker room presence, guy that has a ton of playoff experience. I think that is something that could make sense. So that gets you to 13 full-time players. You need to have at least 14 guys on your roster. Now, the way that the CBA works is you can go 2 weeks with less than the minimum number of guys on your roster, which is 14. You can go 2 weeks where you have 13, but then you have to sign somebody and get back up. And we've seen the Cavs actually straddle this line a couple of times in recent years. And that's partially done when teams want to stay out of the tax. And I would suspect that the Cavs don't want to be in the tax this year because they are going to be in the tax in the coming years with all the big money extensions that have been signed by members of the core four this year. They're going to be a tax team. That's, I think, pretty inevitable. So I do think it's important for them and just the roster building to stay out of the tax this year. So I would be a little surprised if they've got 15 guys on the roster at any point under full-time NBA contracts. And it also would not surprise me if we see them have 13 guys on the roster at times. And then, especially once 10-day contracts can start being signed, they can kind of bounce back and forth and they can spend some time doing that. So that is another thing to look out for as this offseason rolls around. They will have to make moves at some point. I don't know what they're going to be. But thank you again for making today's edition of Locked On Cavs your first listen. And thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. I very much appreciate you everydayers out there that listen and watch Locked On Cavs every single day. I do want to plan on having a mailbag coming up later this week. So start dropping comments on YouTube or tweet at me at Real D Cunningham. Whatever questions, comments you have about the Cavs. I'd like to start doing a mailbag at least once a week during the summer because I do want to. I want to stay with you guys every single day. I do. I think that's a very important thing. There's a lot to talk about, but I want to know what you guys want to talk about too. So again, comment on YouTube, or you can hit me on Twitter at Real D Cunningham, or just tweet at Locked On Cavs too. That'll work. But thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every single day. I will talk to you tomorrow.